Hello and welcome to the second episode in our Funds Download series. I'm Phil Graham, Global Head of the Investment Funds team at Harneys, and joined once again today by Matthew Tabor. Hi, Matt.
Hi, Phil.
You'll be very pleased from the questionnaire that we sent out to all of our clients and contacts that the universal answer to should Matt stay in his loft was yes. Can you confirm that you've followed that?
I have followed that, and I'm spending even more time here now than ever as a result.
That is good to hear, probably both for you and for your family. Fantastic.
I think there's win-win there on that front.
Fully agree. Now, I'm pleased to say that we've actually managed to double the average IQ on this podcast today by bringing in a couple of guests that we promised. First, we have Mr. Phil Kite, the global head of litigation at Harneys, a man with significant experience, probably, and Phil may argue, but more experience in this arena than almost any other offshore litigator there is. So it's a pleasure to have you, Phil, from, I believe, leafy London.
Yeah, just outside London. I'm here overlooking the road, which is normally quite busy. It's not busy, and it's just me and my dog.
Good. We also have Nick Hoffman, the head of our Cayman litigation team, soon to be head and managing partner of our Cayman office. And so, as I'd like to describe you, Nick, sort of going forward, Matt's boss. Pleasure to have you. Pleasure to have you on this cast.
Well, thank you, Phil. It's nice to be here. I'm in Cayman. And unlike Matt, I'm not in my attic. I can see natural light and there's plenty of it, I'm pleased to say. So that's keeping us going through this lockdown.
Fantastic. Well, pleasure to have you both, and thank you for joining us, Matt. To sort of come back to you and to continue from where we sort of left off on our first podcast. We obviously got to March and talked about the sort of wobble that we saw in terms of the markets and the volatility that we saw, and it was interesting to sort of look at some of the responses to our questionnaire and see that actually almost universally managers did very little. That I would guess, given your sage knowledge and experience, you may have actually seen that coming, but I'd be interested to sort of know what conversations you did have during March and sort of a bit of experience about what you expected and what you didn't expect, and maybe had the volatility lasted a little bit longer, where you may have seen people going towards.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're looking at what managers did and didn't do, some of them might say they did quite a lot, but they certainly didn't involve us. And that has continued to be the case. We still have seen and spoken to managers of funds that I think would arguably be described as smaller, or ones that may not have reached critical mass in time before this happened. And so we are having discussions with managers of those funds to close them. And it's actually been quite calmly done. Lots of them are in situations where they've got good liquidity over the asset class. And because one or two of them have actually had prior experience since 2008 of closing down funds, there's less fear around what that process looks like. So the reality is, I think that those managers that are in that position at that end of the spectrum, it's been done quite calmly and we are dealing with it. We still haven't seen any big rush, and I don't anticipate that to be the case for things like redemptions. Monthly, nothing's happened, so we've not had any clients get in touch with concerns about monthly redemptions. And then we're coming up to the end of Q2 now, and if we look at the 15th, 16th of May, so you're 15 days out from your next redemption date, and we still don't necessarily have anything. And then for the end of Q2, we've got 45 days, and we would have expected by now, if there was going to be a rush, to have heard that.
Now, it was interesting to see on the global figures that were published. I think the FT ran an article saying that about 33 billion disappeared from hedge funds in the first quarter of 2020, which was about sort of 1% of the market, and the biggest sort of quarterly outflow since 2009. But exactly as you say, I mean, it didn't look as if that came in a sort of a reaction to the shock or reaction to the volatility. Clearly, there's a lot of other stuff going on in the sort of macro economy at the moment, but it didn't lead to the kind of run on redemptions that we previously saw. Do you think that's because of the sort of the investor base, or do you think that's, as you say, because managers are just more adept now, or why do you think that is?
I think if I was going to guess, I would say that it's more likely that you will see investors and allocators who have been around and went through the financial crisis, who have that element of confidence as to how things may be dealt with, and they can see, and they've done due diligence on managers better over the course of the last 10 years. We occasionally do get a lot of managers who have set up and established post-financial crisis, and they wouldn't have had the same experience. So that may be something to do with it. I think that you also, obviously, when it's a global event like this, there isn't necessarily some sort of flight away from an asset class which would give you something else in an easy sense. Obviously, we do see funds now that are setting up to take advantage of some of the government initiatives like the TALF initiative in the States. We've got a few funds being set up for that, and they're going after new allocations, and there's certainly some anecdotal evidence from fund managers and sponsors who are now adapting to a new way of trying to do capital raise, particularly in the private equity space. We've actually seen better success on their cap raises. So I feel like there's more serenity, I suppose, for want of a better word, amongst the allocator and investor groups than you may have seen historically.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you do wonder if sort of the lack of other available options is also part of it. But
yes, the other funds are available probably doesn't apply in this scenario.
No, I agree completely. I mean, Phil, to sort of bring you in, I mean, I can vividly remember sort of you and I back in 2008, sort of both trying to sort of scratch our head as things started to sort of play out towards the third and fourth quarters, and from both of our angles trying to work out how we'd best deal with what was going on. But before we get to sort of the real horror stories, which is where you and Nick have sort of the real expertise. I mean, can you remember from those times sort of managers that you really felt were getting it right? And if so, you know, what were they doing that sort of impressed you from your side as to how they were best managing these scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, we remember that we thought the whole financial system was collapsing and it was a scary time, just like now is a scary time. There was a lot of litigation that happened in the next sort of 4 or 5 years in BVI and Cayman. I was going through some of the cases and just trying to draw out a few lessons that, you know, if the balloon does go up this time, what people should remember. And I think the first thing is that the parties that did well in the subsequent litigation at trials tended to be ones that had their documentation right. So, you know, they had proper minutes and documents backing up those minutes saying, look, we're looking at option A, B, or C, and option A may be do nothing. But it was properly backed up with, you know, some sort of data. And when, you know, directors, investment managers, trustees had to give evidence at trial, they had a proper document to show the court and say, look, this is why I made this decision at that point in time. And they tended to do very well. The ones that turned up without that documentation still had to, you know, make a go of it, and they came over pretty badly. So I think documentation was the first thing that really struck home to me as something that people should look at. And the second thing is timeliness. The courts, if they saw investment managers or directors or trustees do things in a timely manner and a sensible manner, then they would not so much let people off, but they would take a sympathetic view of that. And of course, if they saw parties that sat on their hands for a while, then they were very tough on them. So I think timeliness was the second lesson. And contractual provisions, I mean, this is obvious stuff, but the courts were very hard on people that didn't look at the contracts properly and good with people that did. So I think in terms of lessons to be learned, it's, you know, read the contract, read the articles, do things in accordance with the contract, timely action, and I think most importantly, proper documentation.
I mean, that's incredibly useful. I mean, Nick, sort of bring in your experience from your side as well. I mean, would you largely sort of agree with all of Phil's points there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. From a litigation point of view, which of course we all hope not to be involved with, it's absolutely essential that you can demonstrate to the court what you've done and why you've done it. It does go back to first principles, and when we were all talking about, you know, reminiscing the consequences and aftermath of market schisms such as 2008-9, you know, some basic things I think do demonstrate managers and directors' part. The key really here is, I think, communication. That's communication between the board internally and also investor relations. And I think that can't really be emphasized enough, because Phil, when you talk about or allude to horror stories, very often they germinate in problems going wrong at the very beginning, and boards not evidencing what they're doing, not discussing their options properly, not potentially taking legal advice early enough, and also that infects the way that they deal with their investors, and very often is a self-fulfilling prophecy. You have a situation that because funds aren't candid with their investors, or candid to the extent that investors feel they should be, you precipitate litigation, because it's the only way that investors feel they can get recompense. So I would say, just adding to Phil's list of, I think, very helpful categories, that communication both internally and externally are key, and that's, I think, an important lesson arising out of the financial crisis.
Matt, sort of throwing it back to you slightly, because I think those are really good points, but you will play devil's advocate and allow you to do so. You know, a manager may well, and you'll have heard this a million times in your career, jump in and say, look, I don't want to say anything to anyone here. I don't want to talk to my investors. I don't want to talk to, people internally. I believe in my strategy, or frankly, I don't want to kick a sleeping bear. The last thing I want to do is communicate. And what would be your position when you've heard that from managers? How do you react to that?
I definitely heard that more in 2008-9 than I do now, because back then, nobody talked to anyone, to be brutally honest. I don't think we even talked to the litigation group at the firm I was at. We knew they were in the building somewhere, and we had to dig them out from a cupboard during 2008-9, because I don't think they knew where we were either. And obviously all that's changed, and that's why we're able to have really good calls like this. So I think that the experience we have now probably sits into two different varieties. One is where there are independent governance professionals involved in the structure, and ones where they aren't. And so where they are, and by that I really mean independent directors or professional directors sitting on the board of a corporate fund, that ability of a manager to kick things into the long grass is really it's not something we see at all anymore. Mainly if you look at the demographic of the professional directors that we have and we work with, almost all of them have been around long enough to have been through 2008-9. We do still see occasionally managers who don't have that type of governance structure, and occasionally have to get into these discussions with them. But to be honest with you, another reason why we don't see it is because they wouldn't be speaking to us if they didn't want to speak to their clients. It would be really quite rare for someone to have ended up on the phone with me who's then unwilling to engage if they think there's a problem. But I think that if you've got a manager who doesn't think there's an issue and who may be reluctant to speak to their investors, we wouldn't know about it necessarily until something's gone wrong.
Can I just jump in there, Phil, because I think Matt really is honing in on a key difference between, if we want to put it ground zero, 2008-9 and now. Independent directors have become professional directors have become so much more part of the landscape of the way in which corporate funds are governed, that in fact a lot of these lessons are at the forefront of their mind, and even if they're not brought in at the very beginning, they're now being brought in at a much earlier stage, so that the communication that Matt's talking about, that I referred to earlier, happens a lot earlier, because these professional directors, from their experience very often as liquidators, i.e. seeing how badly these things can go wrong, are just astute to the fact that they need to get in front of a lot of these issues. And I think that will hugely affect the path of some of these funds if they do get into distressed situations.
I was just going to sort of bring back to our questionnaire, and we sort of asked the client base, who were the first people that you got in contact with, other than sort of, people who sit next to you or remotely at the moment virtually sit next to you. And in the directors, the board were sort of top of that list, really. So it's really important they're bringing their level of experience. And, Matt, I know you speak to a lot of different independent directors from all around the world. So it's a kind of interest in your insight on how they've evolved as well.
Yeah, I think without exception, frankly, within that community that we come across, so that's either the professional community in Cayman or elsewhere, the level of awareness of all sorts of different scenarios that have cropped up between 2008 and now amongst that group is, well, it's unrecognisable to what it was like back in 2008. And frankly, there's almost no point in doing a comparison. So the advantage that a manager can gain in these scenarios from having that experience is actually potentially more valuable to them than it may be when things are running in ordinary course quite well, because you may find for a lot of, like I said, for a lot of managers, their experience potentially of really bad situations may well not be the same as someone who's seen and has got experience of dealing with all sorts of different funds. So that's like, we have the experience, but they've also got someone on the board who's got the same experience. That's invaluable to them because they're able to provide them a level of practical advice and comfort that maybe we're not able to do, whereas we can provide something that's specific to documents and to outcomes.
Agree. Go on, sorry, Phil. I was just about to bring you in on your insight on this, really.
No, I mean, you'd also hope that lessons were learned with some of the documentation, which I think in the last financial crisis
100%.
may have been tested for the first time on a sort of, because everybody was looking at their documents through the prism of, am I going to go to court? And not drafted by Harneys, but some of the articles I saw were pretty ropey and lended themselves to litigation. And maybe, people learn from that, and now the documentation across the board is much better and much clearer and much easier for funds people to action upon.
Yeah, I mean, speaking from as a fund formation lawyer, there was plenty of discussion in 2008 that the documents may have only been looked at for the first or second time. And we learnt an awful lot from that period, and also all the subsequent litigation, because when it comes to how you draft your documents to launch the fund, to do it properly, you have to have the best and the most up-to-date information about the latest case. And that was certainly, there was a period in 2010-11 where there were a number of cases in both Cayman and the BVI that went through the first court up to the Court of Appeal and then to the Privy Council, where depending on the day of the week, we had to change our advice or give different interpretations as to what the documents needed to look like. Thankfully, most of those cornerstone cases have gone through to the highest court of appeal, and we've got much more stability about what documents need to include. And you're absolutely right in that now when a manager asks us to dust off the articles or the offering document, we know with quite a degree of certainty that we can point to specifics and say that's fine because you've got this power or you've got this control.
I think that's a very nice segue into the next podcast. I mean, I think what would be useful if Phil and Nick, you don't mind joining us again, would be to really get into some of the horror stories. But sort of before we finally wrap up and leave for today, Phil, I was wondering if you had a manager who sort of sat there, or indeed, an independent director that's on a board, they've seen the volatility in March, they've wobbled their way through that, but there's no doubt there's a heavy shadow over the global economy at the moment. If you were advising them on just things they should be doing right now, even if their numbers look good, even if everything is working at the moment, the final bullet points you would give to those managers that maybe don't have the experience of 08-09 would be what?
Well, I mean, what you see on the TV is with the virus is test, and I think that's turned out to be probably right. I would say documentation, because that is the thing that in 2 years' time, if you're in a witness box explaining what you did, you really want to point to. So that's what I'd say.
Beautifully wrapped into the UK government's fantastic approach to this virus. Thank you for joining us today, and look forward to speaking on the next podcast.
Thanks, everyone.